Schön, dass so viele hier sind. Ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich im Namen von Soil to Soul zu dieser Keynote, die wir hören werden. Und ich möchte vielleicht am Anfang ganz kurz die Partner erwähnen, die AVINA Stiftung, die auch Patronat ist für diese Veranstaltung, und Stadt Zürich Umwelt- und Gesundheitsschutz und Tom Talent, die eben dieses Symposium unterstützen, dass das überhaupt möglich ist und wir auch so kostengünstig an so tolle Vorträge kommen können. Wir freuen uns sehr, dass Emeran Mayer hier ist. Wir haben uns vorhin schon ein bisschen unterhalten und Emeran Mayer hat mir erzählt, dass er vor 40 Jahren hier in Zürich ein Jahr verbringen musste, muss man so sagen. Er durfte zwar spannende Labormessungen machen und bei Herrn Professor Siegenthaler, der damals die große Koryphäe war, ich weiß, vielleicht kennen die einen oder anderen ihn noch, im Labor mitarbeiten, aber er fand Zürich doch sehr miserable, weil er alleine da war und seine amerikanische Freundin wieder es bevorzugt hat, nach Amerika abzuhauen. Also das war sein erstes Erlebnis in dieser Stadt. Das zweite war dann vor 20 Jahren, als er hier war und 2 Wochen ein Postprofessor einen Vortrag gehalten hat oder ein Seminar gehalten hat in der Psychologie zu Brain-Gut Connection, und da hat es ihm, glaube ich, schon viel besser gefallen, aber er war nur 2 Wochen hier. Und wir freuen uns, dass er jetzt wieder gekommen ist, trotz dieser Widerstände, und uns eben mehr erzählen wird vom Hirn zum Darm und zurück. Er wird 45 Minuten, werden wir die Möglichkeit haben, ihm zuzuhören, und das Neueste aus seiner Research, er hat ja auch Bücher geschrieben, er hat geforscht zu diesem Thema, er ist einer dieser Koryphäen, die eben auf diesem Feld tätig ist, und wir können profitieren von seinem Wissen, und am Schluss, so die letzten 15 Minuten, gibt es dann auch die Möglichkeit, um Fragen zu stellen. Falls Sie, es wird auf Englisch sein, das Referat, falls Sie eine Übersetzung brauchen, dann können Sie das jetzt mit Ihrem Handy gerade mal kurz fotografieren und dann diese App auftun. Das ist eine KI-basierte App, und da können Sie die Sprache auswählen. Ich glaube ungefähr 30 Sprachen, die Sie dann wählen können, und kriegen dann schriftlich den Text 1:1 mehr oder weniger übersetzt als Untertitel für dieses. Wer möchte, genau, es gibt auch noch hier, Linus hat Zettel, wenn es nicht funktioniert. Wer braucht es? Genau, vielleicht ganz hinten. So now, let's say the stage is yours, Emeran Mayer. Thank you so much for being here, and we are so looking forward to learn from you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to come here. Yeah, I have a lot of memories about Zurich, going back, some 45 years, some not so good, others great. But this time it's a real pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that's very close to my heart and interest, this connectedness between personal health, gut health, and planetary health, which is something that fortunately a lot of people are kind of gravitating to. So, and I have to apologize for giving this talk in English, but after 45 years of working at UCLA in Los Angeles and giving all my talks and communicating with all the students only in English, it would be very challenging to give this talk in English. I still can speak German with a strong Bavarian accent because I come from an area close to München in Germany, but scientifically it would be very difficult to do that. So I'm on the scientific advisory board of a lot of companies, but I will not tell you about any supplements or anything that you should buy. I'm not endorsing any of these products, and it's really nothing to do with this talk. The overall topics I want to touch upon, and hopefully there's not too many slides that I brought with me. Tell you a few things about the brain and the gut connectomes. I'll explain this to you in a minute, what I mean with connectomes. Then how the brain, the gut, and the microbiome talk to each other 24 hours a day, how diet and lifestyle affect this communication, what role a change in this communication could play in common brain disorders, and then this One Health concept. So this One Health concept, I recently spoke at meetings. One was about very interesting topic also, from personal to planetary health. Another one about planetary consciousness. I never thought working in the microbiome field and brain-gut interactions that ultimately I would end up talking to audiences on these various topics. The model that has evolved over time, so a lot of people call this the brain-gut axis, which is kind of a not the right term, because an axis is a linear system, or what happens on one end in the gut, for example, affects the brain. It's really a system with multiple feedback loops where everything is connected in bidirectional ways, and it involves multiple nodes in this system. So from the immune system, the brain, the gut, the microbiome, and what's called the exposome, basically anything that goes on outside of us in the world. So this was something that what actually got me into studying medicine. I can't explain it to you how this came up. For me, it's always been the most fascinating aspect, how the brain and the body interact. It wasn't the gut in the beginning that I studied, but the heart. But somehow this connectedness between these brain and body was something from the very beginning. And I'm glad I stuck with it, despite a lot of resistances by the traditional medical system that I was always told by the senior professors. Yes, we all know that the brain and the emotions are connected with the body, but we can't really study it. So let me start with the top down. Most of my talk will be about how the microbiome and the microbes and their mediators communicate with the brain. But what came before that, the interest, and that's our initial studies were all on this, how the brain talks to the gut. So in the top line, you see these faces. Everybody will recognize what emotion each face represents. So essentially, when our brain, the emotional system in our brain generates an emotion, it will be reflected in the contractions of muscles in our face. What we don't know or don't pay attention to, the same thing happens inside of us. So the gut gets all these same signals that the muscles in the face get, and will generate patterns that are somewhat specific to the type of emotion. So in the terms of fear, and these are all negative emotions, there's very little known about positive emotions. It's only more recently that funding agencies are willing to invest in studying positive things. Most money goes into studying diseases and negative emotions, like in psychology. So in the emotion of fear is associated with a slowing of gastric emptying and contractions in the second part of the large intestine. Anger, you have both the contractions in the stomach and in the end of the colon. And with sadness, there's basically an inhibition of both the gastric and the intestinal motility. We'll come back to this later, because when we talk about the microbes that live in this environment, particularly not so much in the stomach, but in the small and large intestine, the microbes are affected by these reactions as well. So the gut reactions will, or in other words, the microbes will always know what emotional state that person is in, both by changing the transit through the gut, but also direct communication between neurotransmitters released in the gut during these emotions and receptors on these microbes. So let's stay with the brain for a few minutes. You don't need to understand any of the details of this, but in the research that our center at UCLA performed with using primarily different modalities of brain imaging, structural and functional, we identified these different brain networks that are engaged in response, for example, with something that goes on in the gut, information being transmitted to a sensory motor network and a salience network, and you can see it, and ultimately the signals get to the central autonomic network, which then through the autonomic nervous system transmits the end result to this computation. It goes in the brain in these different networks, goes back to the gut and generates these different patterns that I showed you earlier. So this is something, again, it's not a linear system. It goes through a lot of computation when something happens in the gut. Most of these things we don't perceive unless somebody has a disorder like irritable bowel syndrome, where many of the activities in the gut are perceived as pain and discomfort, but normally these gut sensations are not consciously perceived. When somebody says they made a decision based on their gut feelings, that's a whole different story, but it's not really related to that what we call this transformation or processing in the brain connectome. And so the model that has sort of evolved from all this work, that things that go on within the brain, is all these networks now put together on one image. So stress, reactivity, anxiety, sensory perception generates a signal that goes back to the gut and changes something, and we'll come back what goes on in the gut in a minute. Changes this system in the gut, and then the gut generates molecules, signaling molecules that feed back to the brain. So we always have this circular motion. None of these things happen in isolation. So what happens in the gut is perceived in the brain, with and without consciousness, and what happens in the brain is perceived in the gut and by the microbes, and vice versa. A few words about the gut. So most people think about the gut as sort of a fairly, or at least this was the case when I started my medical training, a fairly simple organ that is mainly concerned with breaking down food, digestion, absorption, and getting rid of waste material in the colon. In the meantime, a lot of things have happened, kind of a revolution, really. One was the discovery and detailed descriptions of the enteric nervous system, or the so-called second brain. It's about 150 million neurons, nerve cells that are sandwiched in between the layers of the gut. The main function of this network is not unconscious or something that has to do with our emotions. It's really the fine-tuning and the regulation of gut function, secretions, peristalsis, motility. Then we have the gut-based immune system. 70% of the immune system is located in the gut. So you not only have this second biggest accumulation of nerve cells, but also the biggest concentration of immune cells. And then you have a number, about 40 different types of cells, hormone-producing cells in the gut endocrine system, which is one of the biggest endocrine systems in our body. So when we talk about endocrine system, think about the ovaries or the testes. In the gut, it's organized differently. It's spatially distributed. Throughout the gut, there are these cells shown in color at the bottom. And there's about 40 different of these cells with that contain different hormones, either alone or most typically in combination. So one of the most well-known of these is GLP and GIP. They've gotten a lot of attention and press recently because of the Ozempic, the weight loss drugs. It's interesting. So I started my research at UCLA and worked with one of the leaders in identifying these cells. It was a very exciting time. And even though we characterized all these different cells, the big question was, what do they have to do with any human disease or any process? It really took some 40 years before now with GLP-1 antagonists this to sort of become the one of the hottest topics. And it's not the end of the story yet, because I think what will evolve from these current GLP-1 agonists, we don't really know yet. It could be the miracle drug really of this century. Okay, finally ended up with the microbes. So the oldest and most prevalent life form on the planet has been around for billions of years. There's trillions of these cells, make up about 40% of the numbers that we have. Human cells or microbial cells. They live throughout the gastrointestinal. Well, actually, they live throughout the entire digestive system, from the oral cavity to the colon. The highest concentration is definitely in the large intestine. The further you go down, the more the denser these microbes are. They have lived in symbiosis with us humans, again, or with mammals for millions of years, and with us humans at least for a million years. Almost every living creature has a microbiome, from the cockroaches to butterflies to giraffes. Virtually any life form has a microbiome, which means in evolution this is a very preserved trait of living organisms, that they live in symbiosis with these invisible inhabitants of our guts. More important than this large number of individual microbes and 1,000 species are really the number of genes that they have. So I told you earlier that they have existed for billions of years. They were the dominant life form in the oceans long before animals appeared. They had a lot of time to develop a very sophisticated language, communicating with each other, but also communicating with their surrounding. In the oceans, there was nothing else around. So this is one of the reasons why, as opposed to us humans, we just have 20,000 genes, the microbes have millions of genes. Most of them we don't really know their function. So this field is really at the beginning of understanding what the importance really is. But I always think about it, so the wisdom of the microbiome must be tremendous. So it's something that has been around for billions of years, has survived every catastrophic event on the planet, and they will be here no matter what happens with the planet, no matter if it heats or there's a nuclear war. The microbes will always be here because they can adapt rapidly to any new information. It was also remarkable that we've written all our textbooks and teach medical students about diseases, but we only take about 1% of the genes that contribute to our health and diseases into account. 99% of these genes and what they encode, we don't really pay any attention to. This was okay up till now. Obviously, medicine has been extremely successful in developing medications, but we're failing tremendously in dealing with this, what I call this chronic non-contagious disease epidemic that we're currently in, which is worsening all the time. Medicine is helping us to keep people alive, but not to prevent these diseases like type 2 diabetes or Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. All these diseases are increasing prevalence, but fewer people die from them because medicine is coming up with newer and newer medications. So I'm throwing in a few slides from a book from one of my former colleagues, Fergus Shanahan, who was the head of the Department of Medicine at Cork Medical College in Cork, Ireland. And it's just summarizing what I said earlier. The microbes have a lot more genes than we do. And some people have called this is our second genome. We now know they're involved in a lot of functions. I just want to wanted to focus on the immune functions that are listed here, because that's, I think, for our models currently of these chronic diseases, the most relevant. Chronic low-grade inflammation, change in barrier function in the gut, or causing or being involved in the development of a leaky gut, and then this production of anti-inflammatory molecules, the short-chain fatty acids or butyrate. They're also heavily involved in metabolism, satiety, so they play a big role in stimulating cells, for example, these endocrine cells to secrete satiety hormones. And then they also, obviously, that's sort of the area that I've been interested in the most, play a big role in modulating the nervous system, both the brain health, but also the enteric nervous system, where they play a big role in the generation and modulation of motility and secretion. So one thing that got me interested in this field, and I was reluctant to accept it, because after 30 years of studying brain-gut interactions and understanding all these hormones that are being produced and that go to the hypothalamus, we thought we had pretty much figured it all out, how the gut and the brain communicate with each other. So when the first studies came out, again from University of Cork, and also from Canada, basically showing that you could transplant emotion-like behavior from a mouse strain that had like a timid personality. I mean, this is all sort of in a terminology. We don't really know if a mouse can be introvert or timid, but just to sort of make this easier to understand. So if you take stool pellets from these mice, transplant them into a germ-free mouse that doesn't have its own microbiome, but it has a different genetic background, the opposite, so extrovert and outgoing, you can transplant the phenotype of the first one, of the donor, into this mouse, which then also shows this same behavior pattern. Initially, when these studies came out, they were too esoteric for me to really believe it, and then it took a while to kind of accept this, that there's something there that, and these have all been outstanding scientists that came up with these papers. But then most of the studies that's up to now that we have that confirm this connection between the gut microbiome and emotion-like behavior comes from animal studies. It's been much more difficult to translate this into humans for obvious reasons, ethical reasons. We don't have germ-free humans. We can't do these transplants from an unhealthy person to a healthy person, and we'll never do those. So the second best thing is to take stool samples from well-characterized human patients or phenotypes, transplant them into germ-free mice or humanized mice, and then you can see in this classic experiments from Rob Knight's lab at University of San Diego, then these mice adopt the phenotype of the human donor. As a control experiment, if they did this from a lean person, there was no development of an obese phenotype. So after watching these papers come out for a while, we finally decided we should do a pilot study, an exploratory study, and to see if this gut microbiome brain communication actually happens in humans as well. And what we did is we did a randomized control study in healthy young women, where half of the group got a organic probiotic yogurt with several strains of microbes in it, which is commercially available. And then we put these people in a scanner, also assessed psychologically with questionnaires if they felt any different. And then in the scanner, they were looking at these emotionally charged faces, which is kind of a standard test to look at the emotional reactivity. And to my big surprise, and I won't have time to get into the details of explaining this, we saw changes at the brain level, a difference between the individuals that gotten a placebo product without these microbes and those that ingested the probiotic cocktail, that the connectivity between brain regions involved in emotional reactivity changed, so there was less connectivity between these brain regions after in the group with the probiotic ingestion. This was actually done with funding from a well-known company. Don't want to use the name here. And to our big surprise, they were not interested in pursuing this further. Actually, they were concerned that this could hamper the popularity of the product, that people would say, if we eat this probiotic, it changes our minds. So in the meantime, obviously, that has changed dramatically. Now everybody, including this company, promotes the product. You feel happier, you feel better. Well, obviously, that would have to go through the brain, but they were never willing to do a follow-up study on this topic. A brief summary of what these microbes actually do in our gut. So they are the interface between the world around us, particularly the things that we ingest, that we eat, both the food but also chemicals, many of the contaminants today, microplastics. They're the interface between these substances from the exposome and our own system. And this is kind of shown here. So the microbes break down all these things, including the drugs. They're very good, almost as good as the liver, in breaking down complex molecular structures into absorbable molecules. And you can see they generate these short-chain fatty acids, for example, from complex carbohydrates, lipids, and as one example here, tryptophan derivatives, so the essential amino acid. They translate them into substances that then interact on the other side of the gut barrier, either go into the systemic circulation or engage with receptors on vagal sensory, on vagal afferents, or they interact with the immune system, particularly these dendritic cells that have these sensors sticking all the way into the lumen of the gut. So it's essentially a translation of all the things that we put inside of us, voluntarily or involuntarily without knowing it, that are being translated into substances, into a language that our organs understand. One particularly interesting aspect of this is, so there's a lot of very large molecular structures that that are part of our diet from the time that we were born. For example, these human milk oligosaccharides, very large molecules that the mother transmits to the infant in the form of breast milk, that are not targeted in feeding the baby, but in feeding the microbes, because they cannot be absorbed by the baby's gut. They have to be broken down by the microbes into smaller molecules that can be absorbed and then affect the structure of the microbiome. Well known are complex carbohydrates, which again, if you don't cook them or process them or ultra process them before, it's the same kind of thing, very large molecules that cannot be absorbed in the small intestine but have to be broken down. Another group are the polyphenols. I don't know how many people are familiar with those. They're often misclassified as antioxidants. Well, they're antioxidants if you put these molecules from fruits and vegetables into a test tube, but if you have somebody ingest them, the molecules are too large to be absorbed, so they need the microbes to break them down. And then many herbal compounds. If you look at the herbal remedies in Ayurvedic medicine or traditional Chinese medicine, most of them fall into this category of having these large molecular structures. Turmeric, for example, is one of those. They require the microbes to break them down into absorbable molecules. And this is kind of summarizing what happens in this gut microbial transformation and what substances. So we talked about the diet, so polysaccharides, polyphenols, amino acids, microbe-derived components, so cell wall components, LPS, for example, that play a big role in activating the immune system. A lot of this, what we refer to as xenobiotics, all the chemicals, wide range of chemicals that we ingest, probably thousands of these chemicals that are mixed with our food supply, both from agriculture, but also that have been added to them. And then also, interestingly, host-derived molecules. So primary bile acids and steroid hormones like estrogen that are secreted with the bile into the ileum. They are modulated or transformed by the microbes into reabsorbable molecules. So we have this circular transport of, for example, estrogens from our blood, liver, small intestine, and being reabsorbed after the microbes have processed them. And so once these microbial signals have been generated, they can function as neurotransmitters, short-chain fatty acids, so many substances that actually have an effect, demonstrate effect on the brain. And these, what I said earlier about the cell wall components, really important, interact with receptors that activate the immune system, both in the gut but also in the brain. So there's definitely a well-studied history of what happens from the time we're born, or even during pregnancy, until the first 3 years of life, where there's a development or a programming of the gut microbiome and the brain-gut microbiome interactions. This is summarized here. So a lot of factors affect the pregnant mother, from maternal infection, medications, maternal nutrition, maternal stress levels. All of these have been shown to affect ultimately the microbiome of the initially the fetus, but then brain development of the fetus. There's also things that happen postnatally. The mode of delivery, we know C-section versus vaginal birth significantly affect the colonization of the microbiome in the infant, in the newborn during the first year, and then breast milk versus formula fed, another major influence. And then antibiotics, so something that we do, even though we should know better by today. Young children, even from infancy on, so prematurely born babies get multiple doses of antibiotics while they're in the prenatal, in the neonatal intensive care unit. They affect the development of the microbiome in a significant way, particularly during this early programming period. And then, as I already mentioned earlier, so breast milk, these most important components for the microbiome, these breast milk components, human milk oligosaccharides, these large molecules, which are not in formula, not containing formula, but are in human breast milk. And there's a very fascinating way of how they program and nurture. So they're basically determined by the genome of the mother and the nutrition of the mother. They affect the development and the establishment of the microbiome in a very unique way. So multiple factors, all of which sort of affect the gut microbiome during the first, from the time of birth or even before birth, until year 3, when most of this is set in stone, and then determines for the rest of their life this person's quality of diversity, richness of that person's microbiome, and the resistance, resilience, susceptibility to disease as well. So a big factor early on in life are these mother-infant interactions. Again, many studies that have shown this, how they affect positively this early gene expression, interaction of the exposome, the world around, as I showed you previously, with these genetic factors ultimately leads to the formation of these brain circuits, circuits for resilience, motivation, saliency, stress, and ultimately have an effect, these acting together. You remember the slide with the multiple brains, of how, for example, we process signals from the gut or emotional stimuli. The influence, as I mentioned earlier, so the microbes have these millions of genes, so they're very adaptable. They can adapt to a new environment within 24 hours. People have done studies where they switched the diet from a vegetarian diet to a meat-containing diet, and within 48 hours, the microbial composition would change with this intervention. Human genes obviously cannot do that, so this is clearly something that our microbes are masters in. And so a lot of things that happen in the adult can still modulate the microbiome, even though the foundations, the basic blueprint was laid down early on the first 3 years of life. So the adaptability is clearly one of the things that is unique. So what factors modulate the microbiome in the adult? So psychosocial stress, particularly chronic psychological stress, the kind of stress all of us are in developed countries are exposed to. This is not the fight and flight response. This is the chronic worry, anxiety, which has been increasing, obviously, for multiple reasons, even in the last decade. Also, chronic emotions like anxiety, fear, anger, and sadness, they have an effect both on the gut motility, as I showed you earlier, so the habitat in which the microbes live in. So with a fast transit, it's a very different world for microbes to live in it as with a slow transit. But what's even more interesting is that, for example, with stress, norepinephrine, one of the main neurotransmitters of stress, is released into the lumen of the gut and acts on norepinephrine-like receptors on many microbes. Initially, it was only shown for pathogens, which make them more virulent. So when you get a gastrointestinal infection in Mexico, for example, and you're under a lot of stress, or you're a very negative and depressed person, these microbes that cause you gastroenteritis, you will have a more severe form and a longer duration of this gastroenteritis than if you're in a relaxed state. And so what I said earlier, the microbes pretty much know everything that goes on up here in our heads, even though we may not be aware of it. The microbes do, and the microbes will feedback, interact with our gut and these mechanisms with our body, really, and so this circular loop. So everybody knows that, for example, this epidemic of chronic non-contagious diseases that has been going on in the last 75 years or so and is progressing. So, for example, cardiovascular disease, yes, we keep people alive with heart surgeries, bypasses, medications. More and more people are on drugs like to lower cholesterol or lipids, and now Ozempic pretty much. Pretty soon everybody is going to be on these GLP-1 agonists. So we keep people alive. Medicine is very successful in doing this. But the way it started is, as I mentioned to you earlier, was this symbiotic relationship between a healthy gut microbiome and our intestine with these cells just across the barrier that has persisted for hundreds of thousands of years. Yes, people have changed their diet somewhat, but basically it's always been a largely plant-based diet that humans have consumed, and meaning they had a pretty stable gut microbiome over hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years. So what happened with our dramatic changes in lifestyle, particularly, I think it's gotten really accelerated, these changes last 75 years, 75 to 100 years, lifestyle, diet, and stress, the early colonization. We talked about this, so delivery in hospitals, sterile environments, altered exposure to microbes in the environment, and medical practices, particularly the antibiotics and the increasing hygiene. All of these, and particularly at this conference, I should say that the influence of the chemical agriculture and the changes in soil health obviously play a big role in diets. It's not just the main elements, the macro diet, but it's also how these food items are produced as a consequence of what's happened in our environment, in farming and food processing. So the microbes have done their jobs. They have adapted to this new world. So they did exactly the thing that evolution has created them to do, adaptation. And so we have this, what's called a dysbiosis. But now what's happening, that this changed gut microbiome interacting with our gut and all the cells, immune cells in the gut, there's a mismatch between this adapted microbiome and the ancient host features. The gut and the immune system takes genes about 10,000 years to adapt to a new situation. So there's a mismatch, and the mismatch is responded to by the microbes with, or by the immune system with an immune reaction. It's something that the immune system does not recognize as something good for us, so it rings the alarm bells, and it creates a situation where we have first an inflammation at the gut level, engagement of the gut-based immune system, but that also then transmits through the systemic circulation to all the organs in our body. So you can in some ways trace back, and there's a remarkable degree of agreement between different specialties that many of these factors are at the root cause of what we see today in this epidemic. Shown in a little bit more resolution, healthy gut, the microbes separate by a thick mucus layer from the gut wall. You see these dendritic cells I showed you earlier that have these, that stick their tentacles into the mucus layer. They have receptors on them that would respond to any membrane component with an immune reaction, but they can't really do it because they're separated by this mucus layer. So what happens with chronic stress and with the unhealthy diet, called the Standard American Diet, or SAD acronym, that the mucus layer is thinned. Now our normal microbes, even the good ones, come in contact with these dendritic cells. This stimulates a cascade of immune reactions, ultimately leading to an increased permeability of the gut wall, and resulting in a condition which has been referred to as metabolic endotoxemia. So endotoxemia is something with, if you have a severe infection and it gets into your blood, in this case you get the same reaction but without the infection. It's a response to these changes. It's probably correct in so many audiences I talk to, probably about 30 to 40% of people would have this metabolic endotoxemia. It's not measured by your annual exam that you have with your physicians, but if you measure the right inflammatory mediators, you'll see this So a lot of people in the population in the US, and I don't know about Europe, have that condition. When this comes together with genetic risk factors for anything from Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, obesity, it will lead to a chronic disease condition. So a few words about, I think I'm going to make this quicker. So standard American diet, I don't know to which degree this actually translates into a place like Switzerland. I think there's in general a healthier baseline diet in Switzerland and some parts of Europe, primarily Scandinavian countries. This picture I took actually in an elevator in one of the temples of health and one of the Harvard hospitals, the Beth Israel Hospital. In the elevator, this was marketed here. So this is basically the standard American diet. And it consists primarily of an excess of sugar, saturated fats, starchy carbohydrates, and alcohol. Most of these, or all of these, are rapidly absorbed in the small intestine. The microbes won't see any of this. A gut healthy diet is something where you feed your microbes, and these are phytochemicals, fiber, polyphenols, all these large molecules that is really the food and the nutrition for the microbes, which are contained in a predominantly plant-based diet. I think what has happened in our standard diet is we have eliminated most of these. If you look at the amount of fiber and polyphenols that the average person in the US or in the UK consumes, they're all vastly deficient in these molecules. So the Mediterranean diet has received a lot of attention because it has a lot of these molecules in it. It's not vegan or vegetarian, doesn't have to be, but it has as the biggest portion things that have these large molecules, which is the diet for the microbes. Simple solution. So anything that makes our microbes healthy is healthy for us as well. It's the variety of these foods. So if you just eat tomatoes the whole week, it will not have any benefit on your microbial ecosystem health, but you have to, as shown in this study, people that had more than 30 plants in their diet per week showed the increase in particular microbes, the ones that produce these anti-inflammatory short-chain fatty acids. Now this is a slide I just put in last night because I thought that's really relevant to this audience and to this meeting. One of the most fascinating things is this interaction between our soil and soil health and our gut health and our health in general. So plants produce these polyphenol molecules as their own medicine to protect against any stress or infection or infestation. And they require the microbes to do that. So when the plant gets into distress, it sends signals down to the roots, which attracts certain microbes. Then the microbes stimulate this root system to produce polyphenols. Polyphenols go back up into the plant, particularly into the leaves and the fruits. And so when we eat plant-based food that has grown in a healthy soil and a healthy microbial ecosystem, will ingest these polyphenol and as I showed you before, one of the most health-promoting things for our own gut microbiome. If we kill these microbes and make them redundant by chemical agriculture, this has well been demonstrated that there's a decrease in these soil microbes, the way we grow food today in a non-organic or non-regenerative organic way. No matter how many plants we eat, we still don't get the same amount of polyphenols and will not lead to this healthy gut microbial ecosystem. So the ripple effect of chemical agriculture on soil and gut microbial ecosystem, all these things are decreased in the way food has been grown, and particularly, again, I can say this with most confidence in the US. And what organic agriculture does, and particularly regenerative organic agriculture, it prevents these decrease, this situation, and ultimately is beneficial for our gut microbiome. So I think I'm going to, since I come to the end of my time, I talked a lot about this chronic non-contagious disease epidemic. Even though I'm a gastroenterologist, I feel pretty confident to say that gut health or gut microbial health is at the center of this chronic disease epidemic by mechanisms that I showed you, chronic low-grade inflammation. In all these diseases that make up this epidemic, similar mechanisms of low-grade inflammation has been demonstrated. Okay, so a few general things at the end. So clearly, what we do to our microbes, both in our gut and our environment, have a big planetary effect. And in the US, this has been sort of coined the One Health concept, that it's human health, plant and soil health, and environmental health are part of the same spectrum. If you want to tackle one, you should really tackle all of them, because that's the most efficient way of doing it. Listen to your microbes, because what's good for your microbes is good for you. This is, I think, is becoming pretty obvious. You don't have to come up with fancy new diets all the time, as happens on the internet. It's pretty clear, I think, from what we know today, even without more microbiome research, which is still going on in an exponential way. We know exactly what our microbes like and what the health is. So I struggled with getting this message across for a long time in my career, even the brain-gut connection. I'm glad I stuck with it, because finally it received public attention. So we did this documentary for public broadcasting service in the US. Also did a special on the masterclass.com, which was quite an honor to be invited to do that. And I've been invited, I mentioned this earlier, to conferences with people I would have never thought that would have an interest to talk to me, or me talking to them. So this is the famous Sadhguru, with whom I discussed the interactions of consciousness, planetary consciousness, with the gut microbiome. And if you want to read more, so I think there's German translations of the first two books, but you can also go to my website and for other information, including our newsletter and podcasts. So thanks a lot for your attention. Sorry for going over my time.
Thank you so much. It's okay. We take the time.
Okay.
We
good.
take this 15 minutes and extend a little bit our program. So we start with questions for Emeran Mayer. I don't know if someone breaks the ice up front here.
Hi, thank you very much. It was super interesting. I wonder, I saw a keynote, I think 1 or 2 years ago from Uma Naidu, and she wrote the books on mood foods. Do you support this? Like, is it actually possible that there are certain foods that elicit certain emotions?
Yeah, so this concept really comes from a lot of preclinical animal studies where you have these emotion-like behaviors, and you can definitely modulate them with dietary interventions or modulation of the microbiome with all kinds of interventions. In humans, there's some evidence for that to support this, but this topic has created a whole new specialty in psychiatry, nutritional psychiatry. I've interacted with another person, Drew Ramsey, who has also written a good book on this topic. So I don't think right now we can say that any food will actually, if you're depressed or anxious, will do the job by itself. But if you're a psychiatric patient or a psychology patient, I recommend to everybody, in addition to whatever you do, cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness, to change your diet. It has both a psychological effect because you feel better, you're doing something good for your microbes and for the planet. And I think that's, in my opinion, part of the effectiveness, that you feel better just doing that, and preparing, having more awareness of how you prepare your food. And so awareness in this area is a big part of it. That starts with when you go shopping for the ingredients for your meals, eating it together in a social contact. So these are all the factors that are around. It's not necessarily what you eat, it's your awareness and your changed mindset, I think. So I think this nutritional psychiatry is here to stay, and there will be more attention to that. But I wouldn't recommend it to anybody as a single therapy.
Man darf Fragen auch auf Deutsch stellen, oder? Fragen stellen darf man auf Deutsch.
Ja, ja.
Du wirst dann einfach auf Englisch antworten.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had looked at another current non-contagious epidemic, namely ADHD, that might have something to do with when you grow up inside a mother that has chronic stress, and if that may be connected to the gut microbiome of the mother, so you turn out as an ADHD baby.
The group in Cork, Cryan, so they have done studies that actually came out negative. There was not a specific gut microbial alteration, but this may all happen in utero. So some of these things don't just, if you imagine a mother with obesity, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, gets pregnant, what happens in her gut and the microbes, what her microbes generate in terms of neurotransmitters, get to the developing fetal brain and will change that, that development. So I would say there's other factors, obviously social media, excessive social media use that are probably equally or possibly more important. But I think a lot of the clinical science, also in autism spectrum disorders, has focused on kids or patients with that disorder and not what happened in the mother. And there was a lot of political resistance to saying that. So I still remember 10 or 15 years ago, women would protest against this, don't blame it on the mothers, but unfortunately that is, the science points in that direction. So I think if somebody wants to get pregnant, to be aware of this is really important. I think the responsibility for mothers is actually significant, not just in the health of the mother, the diet of the mother, stress level often you can't change.
But how much can you repair with your own behavior later in life?
You can repair something, but within a certain bandwidth, but you're not going to recreate something that would have happened if you didn't have all these compromised beginnings. So I think overall, the health of our gut microbiome has been deteriorating. Just the same extinction that we see in the macroscopic world happens internally as well. And unless we dramatically change the way we live and eat, which I have doubts that will happen. I mean, you guys are doing a great job in, making people aware of it, but there's so many parts in the developing world, in Asia, where the problem is even bigger now in China with obesity and metabolic syndrome, that I'm not sure if you really are going to be able and willing to make these dramatic changes that prevent it. So some people have thought about, well, we could do fecal microbial transplants in newborns who don't have, because they get the reduced diversity from the mothers. In the newborn, that would be possible, but obviously there's a lot of ethical concerns. Who would be willing to have their newborn receiving a fecal transplant from somebody? It wouldn't come from a human, most likely. It would come from a combination of microbes that are cultured, so it wouldn't be a typical transplantation. Some people, like Martin Blaser, who's published this book, Vanishing Microbes, thinks that that may be the only way to actually prevent where we're going. You know, it's this is just another part of these polycrises that we're in. Nobody thinks about that part, but clearly the extinction that we see in the macroscopic world happens inside of us as well. And
more questions? Yes, up here, back there, and then front here.
Würden Sie sagen, dass die gestiegene Menge an tierischem Fleisch, was wir konsumieren, seit den letzten 20, 30 Jahren eine negative Auswirkung auf unsere Gesundheit, das Mikrobiom etc. hatten?
die Menge von der Fleischernährung?
Ja, weil wir ja heute viel mehr Fleisch konsumieren, als wir das noch vor 10, 32 Jahren gemacht haben.
Yeah, so I don't think it's that important, the amount of meat, as long as the meat doesn't come from cows treated with antibiotics, where you ingest, the same amount of antibiotics you would get from taking the pills. It's more important that you have the sufficient intake of the plant-based component, because that's sort of like, I can't emphasize this enough, the anti-inflammatory effect of these short-chain fatty acids that come only from plant-based foods is, it has an effect on every cell in your body, from the gut to the brain, and it's not the same. Yeah, there's some supplements with butyrate that people are marketing. It's not the same as if you have this constant supply of a varied amount of these plant components. So I would say the meat per se, if it's from healthy raised animals, is probably not that important as if you just, for example, I've been on a recent visit to Parma, to a nutrition meeting, and it was kind of interesting that, so you would think Mediterranean diet, but we could not, in the restaurants, the main dish was always the tortellis, ham, Parmesan cheese, and no salad or vegetables with it, which amazed me. That in a place like Italy, that this would be the main diet in restaurants. Surprisingly, and this goes against a lot of the things that I said, I looked up the life expectancy in different parts of Italy, comparing, for example, Sicily, where it's still a more traditional Mediterranean diet. The life expectancy is the same with this part of Italy, the Emilia-Romagna. So there's some things that don't fit exactly into what I've been telling you in terms of epidemiology. But I would still say the variety of the plant-based food coming from organic sources is probably the most important recommendation that I would say.
There's a question up here.
I was wondering, do we know what a healthy gut is? And if we do you see this coming as a part of a diagnosis when people go to their
Can you say it again?
I was wondering, do we know today what a healthy microbiome is? And if we do you see it used as a tool in the diagnosis?
Thank you.
Yeah, so a healthy microbiome, just, people have been debating this question for a long time. It's an ecosystem, we know from ecology that any system that is high in diversity and richness, so has a diverse population, and each population has a certain amount, it's not just one member of each population, that's the main criteria for health of an ecosystem, which gives this ecosystem resilience and resistance against diseases. And I think that's the best explanation. But then there's also this issue, people live in different parts of the world. And with the adaptation of the microbiome that I showed you, this rapid adaptation to new environments, so people that live in Bhutan, for example, as opposed to the US, both people may be healthy, but have very different microbiomes. And when people from some Asian countries come to the US, the microbiome adapts pretty rapidly to the US average, which is not really health. If 40% of your population have metabolic disturbances, that's not a healthy population. So this is a whole other problem, that our healthy control groups are not really healthy. If you look deeper, they don't have an overt disease, but they have an altered microbiome, and they have inflammatory parameters in their system that indicates. So I would say, I would stick with what I told you earlier, what we know from any ecosystem: high diversity and richness are the two key. And that may be lower. So, for example, the indigenous people living, so I once had the big luck during my college times to go on a film expedition to the upper Orinoco River, to the Yanomamis, and they have the greatest diversity and richness of the microbiome anybody in the world. And at the time, obviously, I didn't even know that I was going to go into medicine. There's no idea about the microbiome. Didn't pay much attention of what they were eating, and it's still a largely plant-based diet, even though the men go hunting, they shoot an occasional monkey, or catch a fish. But even though they're surrounded by all these wild animals, they eat very few of them. They have this diet mainly focused on tuber, berries, plant-based foods. So probably no coincidence that they have the healthiest microbiome based on the criteria I said earlier, the ecosystem criteria, because and what I often heard is, well, a lot of these people die in their 50s. Well, they die of non-natural causes. They have a lot of wars, neighboring villages. There's animals, snakes, poisonous animals. But the ones that actually survive live into their 80s and 90s without any medication. So it's definitely something that we wouldn't have. Take away all the medications that people take in a Western society, and our life expectancy would drop dramatically, probably back into the 70s.
Also the issues of maybe stress and air and whatever pollution.
A lot of these factors that contribute to it.
I think we have time, and a lot of people already leave because they might go to some other workshops or events, but we have time for one more question. I think that was here. One more? No, maybe not. Yes?
But you kind of already said it a
Okay.
lot to the last two questions, but just, so would you say that a plant-based diet is the best, or like only plant-based diet, or is perfectly fine for a healthy gut and healthy microbiome? Or would you say, no, it would still be better to have like the animal product component?
Yeah, so I mean, the Mediterranean diet, traditional Mediterranean diet, I mean, this has changed a lot. If you go to Italy now, as I mentioned in Parma, there's no traditional Mediterranean diet anymore. And if you go to an Italian restaurant, it's not the same. But it's a good example. It's not a vegetarian or vegan diet, which actually many studies show are not necessarily the best for life expectancy, longevity, and health. Particularly, like psychiatric morbidity, for example, is higher in some studies of vegan populations, and it may be that if you have a psychological issue, you're more likely to become a vegan or a vegetarian because you feel better. So it's not that you have to completely eliminate meat products out of it, but things like processed meat, the sausages, and coming from Bavaria, there's a lot of things that would be considered the unhealthiest.
Speck.
Yeah, the unhealthiest meat products that you could conceive of. But certainly seafood, poultry, chicken, and a small amount of beef is definitely consistent with with that dietary pattern. I would not recommend that somebody becomes a vegan or vegetarian for health reasons. If you're becoming for ethical reasons, it's a different story, or for, but for purely medical reasons, it's a diet that has a small amount of these meat products is definitely better for your health.
It's more about the diversity, right?
Diversity?
I mean, vegan doesn't mean that it has to be healthy if you eat fries every day, which is also vegan. It's more about the diversity.
The diversity, it's a question of the diversity. Maybe that leads me to maybe a last question. Is it a recipe if we expose our gut to different diets eventually? Like on vacation, you go maybe to Japan, you have 4 weeks of Japanese food, and then you come back and you go to Italy and whatever, you eat more of that. Is that something that's good for the gut?
I mean, you wouldn't do it for the gut. If you feel good about it, I mean, if you feel good about it, I do. I love to explore new food items in different countries of the world. I've probably tried everything, looking back. But it's, I mean, there's an interesting thing happens. Once you become conscious of many of the things that I talked about, and you have identified this diet meets all the criteria, and it's good for your gut microbiome, it's good for the planet, which has become a big thing for me as well. I mean, I don't just say what's good for me. I think this selfish attitude is something that a lot of people on the internet promote, just think about your own health. So there's these other considerations that you actually don't want to switch it, even though, I would explore it. And there's healthy, many of the traditional Asian diets are probably as healthy as the Mediterranean diet. They just haven't been studied as much. All the research is focused on the Mediterranean diet, but if you look at the longevity, for example, in Japan, Okinawa, Korea, so they have the highest percentage of centenarians, and it's predicted the same thing will happen in China. So the traditional diet before the westernization of the food supply happened, they're all health promoting. It's not. I think the worst offense that happened really has happened in the English-speaking countries. UK, US, Canada, Australia. You see the same trends because I think the US companies have dominated these markets. And make a short answer to your question. No, I think you should not get distracted from enjoying your trip anywhere and should try every food possible. Within these 2 weeks that you travel, yes, your microbes will probably change temporarily, but when you come back, they'll go back to the healthy pattern.
Emeran Mayer, herzlichen Dank für diese Ausführungen und diesen Einblick in Ihre Forschung oder deine Forschung und danke vielmals für den Besuch in Zürich.
Vielen Dank.